When we first study psychology, we're usually taught to think of it as a scientific pursuit. And so I originally pictured it as researchers and clinicians carefully observing human behavior, testing hypotheses, collecting evidence, and gradually, over time, building more accurate models of how the mind works and of human nature. And to a large extent, that's exactly what psychology is, and it's one of the reasons why it is such a well-researched and discipline that is taken seriously. It's given us extraordinary insights into learning, memory, emotion, mental illnesses, trauma, human development, and the theories that are utilized within psychology are supported by decades of empirical research. And that scientific foundation is one of the reasons why psychology itself is strong in many regards as a discipline. Over time, interestingly, I noticed something as a psychologist that the discipline and the science didn't seem to explain or explicitly note. And that is that the theories, the psychological theories and therapies themselves often felt very personal. And it seemed as though many of the questions that psychologists devoted their lives to answering were not simply intellectual curiosities, but were questions that were deeply significant within their own lives. And that observation led me to wonder whether psychological theories are not only scientific models, but also in some sense autobiographical. And that's not to say that they are simply opinions or that they lack empirical support, but it's the note that the experiences we live through often shape the questions we ask, the problems we become fascinated by, the type of suffering we experience, and the solutions that we create to that suffering. I originally considered that theories like CBT or DBT or ACT, humanistic therapy, Gestalt therapy, were created out of a vacuum, and that they said something meaningful and profound about human nature. But when one really takes each of these therapies seriously and delves into what they consider human nature, before we get to what other techniques that they have that can help reduce suffering, and we consider what do they consider people as and how do humans function, before we get to the techniques to help that functioning, we notice that there is a lot of difference in these, and the difference is not something that the science can explain or that there is strong evidence that can differentiate between them. And this is what led me to notice that when we look through the history of psychology through the lens of therapies reflecting their creator and reflecting the psychologist who developed that, more than an objective human nature, that it was very difficult not to notice a pattern running through all these therapies. And so let me talk a little bit about what these therapies and therapists had going on in their lives that may reflect what they ended up developing. And I do want to note that this isn't me just saying that all therapies are autobiographies, but there is a large element of them that are deeply personal, and I think it's really interesting to consider that and to consider the implications of that. Because as an early career psychologist, I was initially trying to discover what is the truest therapy, what is the truest psychological theory. Because if I could discover what the truest theory is and I could understand why humans are the way they are, then I could do my best work and make a positive impact. But what I've discovered over time is that a lot of these theories are equally true in their own ways and that differentiating between them doesn't only come down to the evidence, because the evidence can be strong for a lot of theories. It often comes down to personal choice and experience and what resonates with the practitioner. Now, for example, the creator of logotherapy was Viktor Frankl, and Viktor Frankl's life experience was as a survivor of Nazi concentration camps. And inevitably, in a situation like this, questions of suffering, hope, and meaning become matters of life and death. And it is perhaps unsurprising that he would later devote much of his life's work to understanding how meaning can sustain people through suffering. We've also got Alfred Adler, who experienced significant illnesses and physical weakness during his childhood and later developed a theory centered on feelings of inferiority and the way people strive towards competency and significance and mastery of the things going on in their lives. We've got Erik Erikson, who developed a theory of development, and he spent much of his own life questioning his own identity and who he was because of a strenuous relationship that he had with one of his parents. And this culminated in him changing his own last name as an adult to Erikson, essentially taking on his own name. And his most influential contribution then became a theory describing how identity develops across the lifespan. We have got Carl Rogers, who has consistently emphasized the healing power of being deeply understood and accepted. And he has noted that in his own life, he has felt misunderstood within his upbringing, within conversations with other people, and has noted that he never truly felt understood. And it is tempting to wonder whether this became one of the central questions that shaped his work and that shaped his emphasis on active listening. We've also got William James, who struggled with periods of depression throughout his life and became fascinated in this regard by consciousness, by subjective experience, and the varieties of human existence. And you can find online some of his writings at the times when he went through periods of depression, and they are beautiful and can also reflect very early stages of what psychology and therapies would eventually look like. We've also got the Gestalt therapist Fritz Perls, who rejected what he saw as an overly intellectual approach to understanding people, and instead he emphasized direct awareness, embodiment, and experiencing life in the present moment. And this somewhat reflects his own turbulent personal history, his dissatisfaction with orthodox psychoanalysis, and his lifelong search for authenticity. And we can see on YouTube, there's a video called Interviews with Gloria, where Albert Ellis, who was a cognitive therapist, Carl Rogers, the humanistic, and then Fritz Perls, the Gestalt, had a conversation with Gloria as a client. And it was meant to showcase their different approaches. And we can see that Fritz had a very unorthodox approach to what we're used to. He very much challenged Gloria and laughed at times that may have felt inappropriate and really pushed. And it was somewhat uncomfortable, but that reflects an approach that he thought would be helpful because it reflected his own dissatisfaction with the context that he was in. And I'd also like to quickly touch on some of the modern therapies and how it relates to them. So, for example, dialectical behavior therapy was created by Marsha Linehan, and the therapy is built around emotional regulation, acceptance, and distress tolerance, and is especially suitable for people that have diagnosed borderline personality symptoms. And Marsha herself has spoken about her profound emotional suffering and her own experiences with BPD when she was a young person, and through her own experiences developed a theory that essentially solved her own suffering. I don't like the word solved, that is the word I said, but creating something that could soften her own experience in life. We've also got Albert Ellis, who was part of the creation of rational emotive behavioral therapy, which is a branch of CBT, and he described himself as an intensely anxious young man who deliberately challenged his own fears through repeated exposure and relentless examination of his beliefs. And it's difficult not to see echoes of his own personal journey within REBT's emphasis on identifying irrational beliefs and replacing them with more flexible and rational ones. We have got Aaron Beck, who also was one of the heads of cognitive therapy. He initially trained in psychoanalysis, but became increasingly dissatisfied when his observations consistently failed to support the predictions that psychoanalysis promised. And rather than continuing to accept the theory that he had inherited, he turned towards his own careful observation of the patient's thinking patterns. And so cognitive therapy can be understood not only as an advance in the science and past psychoanalysis, but also as reflecting Beck's own disposition towards careful empiricism when a dogmatic approach was not working. And then we've also got the creator of acceptance and commitment therapy, Russ Harris, who's written openly about his own struggles with stress, depression, perfectionism, and the pressure to control difficult internal experiences that he placed upon himself. And so ACT's central message can be read, at least in part, as a response to those experiences, and the message is that suffering often increases when we fight our thoughts and emotions, and decreases when we make room to accept them and we diffuse from our thoughts and create space from them. So that is perhaps interesting, perhaps a load of confirmation bias. And of course, none of these prove that the theory is simply a projection of the creator's life. Human beings are always very complex, and psychological theories stand or fall more on the quality of their evidence, not on the biographies of the people who propose them. But nevertheless, the pattern is very difficult to ignore, and our deepest questions often become our life's work. And perhaps what psychologists and philosophers choose to study is not random at all. Perhaps the questions that become psychologically unavoidable for us as humans within our lives gradually become the theories that we build ourselves, not only as psychologists, but as human beings, perhaps as philosophers, perhaps as spiritual people, perhaps as religious people. And it's just something that is interesting to note. Now, why does this matter? Because the more I reflected on this, the more I began to truly consider that theories are not created in a psychological vacuum. And this goes for all theories, not just psychological ones. Before a theory is ever tested empirically, before it can be seen as fallible or verified somewhat, an individual at some stage just has to notice something about experience. Someone has to become captivated by a particular aspect of human existence, of their own lives, and they need to decide that there is a question that is worth asking, that there is a problem worth exploring, and that there is a solution worth finding. Now, science is extraordinarily good at evaluating theories, refining them, and determining whether they are effective. And that is one of the things that I love most about science, because it is institutionalized fallibility. It is an obsession with proving things wrong in order to figure out what is the closest thing to the truth. And when science is done seriously and taken seriously, and isn't just a dogmatic attachment to theories, there is something very honest going on when it comes to better understanding why some things work better than other things. But we need to consider that science can't explain why fully one person, as a psychologist, may become interested in attachment, why one person becomes interested in trauma, why one becomes interested in cognition, in identity, in suffering, in existential matters. It is largely complex and largely based on factors within the individual that we will never know. Now, perhaps what I found most interesting, whether it is profound or not, is that the theories that are created are not only explanations of the world, they're not only explanations of human nature, and we don't have to take for granted that they explain what life is like for all people. They are also largely expressions of what their creators found impossible to stop thinking about. And we can't know whether these theories, at their essence, before we get to analyzing them, whether the theories say more about being human and the human mind, or whether they say more about the person that has created them. And I imagine it's somewhere in between. Now, I think that there is something about all of this that extends far beyond psychology. When I look at philosophy, I often find something similar, which is that some philosophers become preoccupied with certainty, others with freedom, with language, suffering, consciousness, morality, God. And while their conclusions differ dramatically, the questions that they devote themselves to and the answers that they come up with reflect something deeply personal about the lives they have lived. And again, I would say it may largely reflect more about them and their experience rather than reality or truth. Perhaps our beliefs, my beliefs as a human, are never simply abstract conclusions reached through pure reason and logic. They are also very much ways of organizing experience and responding to uncertainty and making sense of suffering and navigating existence as it appears to us. And it doesn't mean that these beliefs are irrational. It doesn't mean that truth is irrelevant. And it doesn't mean that we can't know reality. I don't think that we have the knowledge or ability to make claims that absolute. But rather, I think there is a suggestion there that reason is often working together with lived experience, and they are shaping both each other at the same time, and the questions that we ask as well as the answers that ultimately feel compelling to us. Now, if what I'm talking about is true in a sense, not objectively true, but there is some truth to it, there is a pattern there that we can identify, I think this has profound implications on the nature of disagreement. Now, if I start with thinking about psychologists, two therapists can disagree on something not because one is right and the other is wrong, or one is closer to reality and the other is less close, but sometimes it may not be about truth at all. It may just be two people, specialists, experts, illuminating different aspects of the same complex reality. They are people expressing different experiences and different upbringings and different interests and different values because their own experiences and lives have drawn their attention towards different dimensions of human life. And that's not to say that in many contexts there are views that may seem to match reality more closely in a lot of ways, or may seem to be fairer or more strict or more rigid or more open or more progressive or more conservative. But a lot of the time this has nothing to do with proving someone wrong or proving them right. I think that comes secondary to understanding where that person is coming from and why they may believe what they believe, because often we try to convince other people of what we believe through reason and through logic and through evidence and through facts, when a lot of the time both sides may have reasonable evidence or at least that person thinks that the evidence is reasonable, and we can't convince someone to find what they find convincing unconvincing. That is very difficult. We don't choose what we find convincing. We don't choose what we find believable. That is largely already within us. And that is why I try to, I guess, now see disagreement not as a battle, which is demonstrating that one system must eventually defeat the other system, and it's just going to be an endless debate until all people assimilate towards one belief. Like, no, I don't think that's what's needed. We perhaps would find it easier to understand conflict and disagreement as different human beings encountering different aspects of reality, and they are doing this from different positions within it. Now, evidence matters, logic matters, ethics matters, and critical thinking matters, but humility also matters too. And I think humility is a core value that would make disagreements much easier to resolve, and that would make our attachment to our beliefs and ideologies a little bit softer. No single framework is likely to exhaust the complexity of what it means to be human. Now, the reason that this idea has become so important to me is because, like many psychologists, I initially spent years and years looking for a correct theory of psychology and the most accurate way to understand people, a pervasive theory of everything that would mean that I can truly understand the person sitting across from me and the suffering that they're going through, and can perhaps maybe give them something objective and something tangible, and say, I see you and I know what's going on, and this is what is going to make it better. And I wanted a framework that I could trust would reflect reality, so I could lean on this. There's no way of being wrong if I know reality. I can't guide the person into a direction that they shouldn't be going in if I know what is true. Suffice it to say that I could not discover that truth, no matter how much evidence I looked into, how much research I did. And what I've found is that over time, the question has shifted. Instead of asking whether a theory is true, I now also ask what kinds of human experiences made that theory make sense to its creator. And what were they noticing in people in their lives? What kinds of suffering did they experience? What kind of questions were they drawn to? And with me, why do some theories feel more meaningful or useful to me clinically than others, even when they're all evidence-based? And in a lot of ways, this has changed how I relate to psychological models. I still value science and evidence very highly because they help ground us and they stop us from projecting too much of ourselves onto our work. But I also very much try to stay cognizant that every theory highlights some things whilst missing other things, depending on what its creators were most sensitive to. And in a way, that makes me think of I think it's a Buddhist parable of the blind man touching the elephant, which is that, if the elephant is ultimate truth or is reality, and you have a bunch of blind men touching different parts of the elephant, you'll have one guy saying, reality is the trunk, it's this, reality is the foot, it's this, reality is the tail, it's this. And they're all right in a sense, but they're also all wrong in a sense. And they just have different aspects of a full picture. And it's also worth saying that this metaphor itself presupposes that there is some reality that is there to be discovered. Perhaps there is no ultimate human nature. Perhaps our nature is to be flexible in a sense, and to change and to adapt. Perhaps we don't have a nature that we can absolutely find. Perhaps we have the ability to create our nature. I don't know. But when it comes to psychology, I'm reminded of a quote from Irvin Yalom, which is that let me just acknowledge that Irvin Yalom has made some very questionable decisions in his career, and in his writings, in his work with clients, and in his personal life. But he did say that every client should have their own therapy. Let me rephrase that. The therapist has to create an individual therapy for every client, and that seems like it would be the most helpful thing. Because what we're essentially saying is every person has a different way of seeing the world. Let's understand how each person does that, and let's listen, and let's work from within that to help them identify the blind spots that they can't see, and then what they want to do with that, rather than us projecting our own view of things on them. So, to conclude, perhaps psychological theories are not purely objective discoveries, nor are they merely subjective opinions. They are many times rigorous and evidence-based attempts to understand human beings, created by human beings who are themselves trying to understand their own existence. It is a field of people trying to understand others by understanding themselves first, and that is a monumentally difficult task. Now, science, as a wonderful, wonderful discipline, allows us to test those ideas. Science places fallibility on a pedestal, and it tries to refine things and reject things and help us grow and understand. Let's see what's wrong so we can move closer to what is right, what is true, what is 0.1% closer to the truth, right? And at the same time, it's worth noting that when it comes to therapies, philosophy is anything. The inspiration for the ideas and the theories begins way before the lab, way before the evidence. And it first begins in ordinary struggles, relationships, losses, questions, and experiences that shape a person's life. So perhaps when I was younger and more naive, if I'm not any less naive, the most important question appeared to be, what theory is true? To be a good psychologist, I would have to know what theory is true. But now that question has shifted to, what kind of life made this theory seem necessary to the person that created it? Why did this theory even develop? What aspects of human existence does this theory touch on? And that perhaps that same question is worth asking of myself and of ourselves as humans. The theories that we are drawn to, the beliefs that we have, the philosophies that we defend, and the values that we hold most tightly may not only reveal our beliefs about the world, the logic that we have used, the reason that we have used, they also largely reveal something about the lives that we've lived, the questions that we've carried, the suffering that we've experienced, and the people that we are still becoming, and the needs that we have as individuals. And perhaps all of this is my own way of being unsure that we can never truly know for certain whether what we are discovering is something about reality, something about human nature, something about ourselves, or just nothing at all.